Welcome back into the archives, traveller. You are standing still inside a medieval city. Food is moving all around you. Before the sun is fully up, carts have already queued outside the walls. Porters are already working. Toll collectors are already counting. None of this is accidental or improvised. In this video, you are not following a farmer, a cook, or a merchant. You are watching a system. You are watching how food actually moves through a medieval city each day, from the moment it approaches the gates before sunrise, to the moment unsold goods disappear back into side streets at dusk. This is not about recipes, kitchens, or preservation. It is about routes, timing, congestion, regulation, and failure. Every sack, basket, and carcass passes through narrow spaces, fixed hours, toll points, markets, and bottlenecks that determine who eats, who profits, and who loses money before noon. If you enjoy slow, factual history focused on how systems actually worked, you are in the right place. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the bell so that you will never miss notifications of new videos springing forth from the archives. Now settle in and stand still. The city is about to wake up. You are standing outside a medieval city before dawn. The walls are still dark, the gates are closed. The city is technically asleep, but food is already in motion around you. Food movement began long before markets opened, because medieval cities depended on timing more than abundance. Producers did not move food when it was ready. They moved it when access points allowed entry and when sellers could legally trade. That difference shaped the entire daily system. Historically, medieval cities set market hours by custom, ordinance, or guild regulation. These hours were not flexible. Missing them meant losing most or all opportunity to sell. As a result, food producers calculated departure times backward from those fixed openings. A dairy worker leaving a village might depart 2 or 3 hours before sunrise. A cart carrying vegetables might leave even earlier to account for road conditions and congestion. Distance mattered less than predictability. You observe multiple streams of movement converging toward the city. None of them are coordinated centrally. Farmers, fishers, millers, and carriers traveled independently, but their schedules aligned because the constraints were shared. Roads narrowed near city approaches. Footpaths merged into larger routes. Animals slowed as traffic thickened. Historically, medieval infrastructure was not designed for peak volume. Roads were built for local use, not synchronized inflow. When many producers arrived at once, movement compressed. This compression happened outside the walls, not inside them. Informal waiting zones developed over generations. Certain bends in roads, roadside chapels, taverns, and cleared areas became habitual holding points where carts paused until gates opened. Weather influenced this timing directly. Rain turned roads into mud. Frost hardened surfaces but shortened daylight. Summer heat accelerated spoilage for prepared foods and slaughtered animals. Winter slowed everything but stabilized transport surfaces. These environmental factors forced producers to constantly adjust departure times. There was no stable schedule, only learned habits. Food that arrived early had to wait. Food arriving late failed. You watch animals shift weight, carts creak, and porters rest against loads. Nothing is sold in this setting. This is positioning, not commerce. The system prioritizes access over speed. Everyone waits for permission. Historically, city authorities tolerated this congestion because it concentrated food where it could be controlled. The city did not attempt to smooth arrival flow. Control mattered more than efficiency. Delay was acceptable. Loss belonged to the producer. As light increases, pressure builds. The gates will open soon. Food has already done most of its traveling. The hardest part lies ahead. You remain in place as the wider movement becomes clearer. Food does not arrive by a single route. It arrives through a layered network shaped by geography, technology, and habit. Medieval food transport relied on three primary systems: overland roads, minor paths, and waterways. Each had advantages and constraints. Each moved different kinds of food. Overland roads carried most daily provisions. These roads were often unpaved, uneven, and poorly maintained. Wheeled carts were efficient for heavy loads like grain or firewood, but vulnerable to weather. Pack animals were slower but more reliable and better suited to narrow paths. Porters carrying loads by hand filled the gaps where animals and carts failed. Historically, road choice was strategic. Producers selected routes based on slope, surface condition, toll locations, and congestion. A longer road with fewer tolls could be preferable to a shorter one with heavy fees. These decisions shaped food prices long before markets opened. Waterways moved bulk goods more efficiently than roads. Rivers, canals, and coastal routes transported grain, fish, salt, and wine from distant regions. Barges could carry loads that would overwhelm carts. However, water transport required coordination with tides, locks, and landing points. Delays were common. Goods arriving by water often reached cities earlier than needed and waited offshore or at quays. You observe that food arriving by water entered the city differently. It passed through ports, wharves, and river gates that functioned as parallel control points. These locations had their own tolls, inspectors, and congestion patterns. Waterborne food often bypassed mainland gates entirely, reshaping internal movement once inside. Minor paths connected small producers to larger roads. These paths were informal and seasonal. They shifted with erosion, land use, and habit. Many were invisible to authorities, which made them attractive for small-scale sellers and smugglers. Cities attempted to regulate these paths with limited success. Historically, route choice affected timing more than distance. A reliable road that allowed steady movement was preferable to a faster but unpredictable one. Producers valued arrival windows over speed. This preference stabilized daily rhythms but reduced flexibility. You see food arriving at different speeds, in different conditions, and in uneven quantities. This variation was normal. The system absorbed it through price shifts and rerouting, not through coordination. As the sun rises higher, all routes funnel inward. Differences in speed collapse into shared congestion. The city draws everything toward its gates. The movement is not elegant, but it is very much functional. It works out of pure necessity. You are standing directly before the city gate now. The movement that was fluid on the road becomes segmented, delayed, and inspected for intentional purposes. Medieval city gates were administrative instruments as much as defensive structures. They concentrated traffic into narrow channels where authority could observe, measure, and intervene. Food entered the city only when it passed through these points, or their waterborne equivalents. This created friction by design. Historically, gate operations followed routines established by municipal charters, customary law, and fiscal necessity. Gate opening times were fixed or semi-fixed. Early arrival did not guarantee early entry. Officials controlled the pace. Food waited until permission was granted. You observe goods being halted, separated, and examined. Toll collectors assessed charges based on commodity type, quantity, and origin. Grain was often taxed by sack or measure. Livestock was counted individually. Fish, vegetables, dairy, and prepared foods were grouped and assessed differently depending on local rules. These tolls were not symbolic. They represented a significant cost that shaped trade behavior. Producers adjusted load sizes, route choices, and arrival times to minimize fees. Some broke loads into smaller units to pass under thresholds. Others pooled shipments to share toll costs. These adaptations altered traffic patterns before food even entered the city. Inspection focused on legality, not quality. Officials verified that goods were allowed for sale, came from permitted regions, and complied with market regulations. Freshness was not assessed. That responsibility was deferred to buyers or guilds inside the city. This separation of control simplified gate operations but allowed substandard food to circulate. You see delays ripple outward. A slow inspection causes carts to back up. Animals grow restless. Perishable foods sit exposed. Time lost here cannot be recovered later. Sellers who miss peak market hours suffer immediate losses. Historically, gates also functioned as exclusion points. Unauthorized traders, especially rural peddlers and itinerant sellers, were often barred entry or redirected to peripheral markets. This protected urban guilds, but reduced overall supply. The result was artificial scarcity inside the walls, even when food was plentiful outside. Corruption and negotiation were common. Toll assessments varied by official, by mood, and by familiarity. Predictability mattered more than fairness. Sellers learned which gates were faster, which officials were strict, and which hours were least congested. These informal knowledge networks shaped daily food flow. You remain still as food inches forward. The city is awake now. The system is fully engaged. Everything that passes this point must find its way through a far denser environment. You are now inside the city. The walls have filtered movement, but they have not organized it. Food disperses immediately. Medieval cities lacked centralized internal distribution systems. Once inside the gate, responsibility for movement shifted from municipal authority to individual actors. Porters, apprentices, servants, and sellers themselves took over transport. This handoff created a second layer of logistics that was more chaotic and more flexible. You observe food splitting into multiple streams. Some goods move directly toward main markets. Others divert toward specialized zones. Meat heads toward slaughter areas or butcher rows. Fish moves quickly toward shaded stalls or covered markets. Bread supplies head toward bakeries or resale points. Each stream follows customary routes shaped by street width, congestion, and enforcement. Historically, internal movement was constrained by urban design. Streets were narrow, uneven, and crowded with unrelated traffic. Carts could not reach many markets. As a result, goods were often unloaded near gates and redistributed by hand. Porters carried loads in baskets, sacks, and trays through alleys and courtyards. These porters formed an essential but under-regulated labor force. Some were affiliated with guilds, others worked independently. Fees varied by distance, weight, and urgency. Competition was constant. Speed mattered, but reliability mattered more. A dropped load could end a working relationship permanently. You notice informal traffic rules. Certain streets favor uphill movement, others favor downhill. Right-of-way is enforced socially rather than legally. Conflicts slow movement but rarely stop it. Everyone involved understands that delay hurts everyone. Historically, cities attempted to regulate this internal flow through ordinances limiting cart access, restricting delivery hours, and assigning specific streets to specific trades. Enforcement was inconsistent. Adaptation filled the gaps. Sellers learned alternate routes. Porters learned shortcuts. Congestion simply shifted location. Food continues moving even after reaching market areas. Sellers reposition goods multiple times during the morning to chase foot traffic, shade, and authority presence. Late arrivals squeeze into marginal spaces. Oversupply clogs walkways. Buyers adjust paths to avoid congestion. You remain stationary as food circulates around you. Movement inside the city is denser, faster, and less predictable than outside. The system functions without oversight because it has no alternative. Everything is now in place. The next phase is not movement toward the city, but movement toward exchange. You are standing at the edge of a market space as food finishes its inward movement and begins to circulate laterally. This is where motion becomes constrained by geometry rather than distance. Medieval markets were not neutral open spaces. They were carefully bounded environments shaped by custom, law, and physical limitation. Some were permanent squares, others were widened streets, churchyards, or forecourts that transformed daily. Each space had a fixed carrying capacity. When food volume exceeded that capacity, congestion became a defining feature. Historically, market placement was regulated to protect order and revenue. Cities designated where specific foods could be sold. Fish, meat, grain, bread, dairy, and produce were often assigned separate zones. These zones were rarely chosen for efficiency. They reflected historical precedent, proximity to institutions, sanitation concerns, and guild influence. Once fixed, they changed slowly. You observe sellers maneuvering to claim advantageous positions. Proximity to main thoroughfares increased foot traffic. Shade preserved appearance and slowed spoilage. Nearness to water sources simplified cleaning. Late arrivals were forced to the margins where visibility dropped and prices followed. Stall placement was often inherited, rented, or assigned by guild membership. Prime locations were controlled tightly. New sellers clustered at edges or temporary overflow zones. This spatial hierarchy shaped economic outcomes more reliably than product quality. Historically, cities enforced placement rules unevenly. Officials focused on maintaining order rather than optimizing circulation. Unauthorized stalls were fined or removed, but enforcement waxed and waned. On busy days, rules softened under pressure. Food volume dictated tolerance. Congestion created secondary movement. Buyers altered paths to avoid bottlenecks. Sellers repositioned goods repeatedly. Assistants carried items back and forth between stalls and storage points nearby. Markets became systems of micro-circulation layered atop the larger city flow. You notice that food does not stop moving when it reaches the market. It shifts, rotates, and reorients constantly. Sellers adjust displays to face traffic. They compress goods as space tightens. They create temporary corridors that dissolve minutes later. Historically, this competition for space favored established sellers with predictable access. Marginal sellers absorbed more risk. When space failed, food failed to sell. The market did not redistribute evenly. The market amplified advantage. By mid-morning, most food has found a position. The question now is not where it is, but when it will move again. You remain in place as the market settles into rhythm. Food is now stationary, but circulation has not stopped. It has shifted from physical movement to transactional timing. Medieval food sales followed predictable temporal patterns shaped by labor schedules, religious observance, and institutional demand. These patterns were not written schedules, they were learned rhythms reinforced daily. Historically, peak buying occurred during narrow windows. Urban laborers purchased food before work or during short breaks. Households sent servants during specific hours. Institutions such as monasteries and hospitals arranged bulk purchases early to secure supply. These overlapping demands created surges. You observe sellers watching the clock indirectly. Bells ring for prayers. Shadows shift. Traffic density changes. Sellers adjust prices subtly in response. Early prices were firm. Midday prices softened. Late-day prices collapsed for perishable goods. Middlemen played a critical role here. They purchased goods early and redistributed them later, smoothing timing mismatches between supply and demand. Their presence accelerated circulation for some foods while slowing it for others. Cities tolerated them reluctantly. They stabilized markets but distorted prices. Historically, market rules attempted to regulate timing. Some cities banned early buying by intermediaries to protect consumers. Others restricted resale within the same day. Enforcement varied. Rules were bent when supply was tight. You see food change hands multiple times without leaving the market. A basket of fish might pass from fisher to reseller to tavern agent within hours. Each exchange altered movement paths and timing. Time pressure increased as the day advanced. Sellers faced a decision: sell now at a loss or risk carrying unsold goods into the evening when demand dropped sharply. This pressure forced rapid price adjustments. Movement resumed as sellers sought alternative buyers. Historically, timing failures caused more loss than distance or tolls. Food that arrived on time but sold late failed. The system punished misalignment more than scarcity. By early afternoon, the primary circulation phase ends. Food that has not sold begins to move again, not toward buyers, but toward secondary destinations. You remain stationary as the visible market activity begins to thin, but food movement does not slow. It changes direction. Not all food in a medieval city was destined for open market exchange. A substantial portion was diverted deliberately and predictably toward institutions that operated on schedules separate from ordinary consumers. These institutions shaped daily food movement without appearing dominant in the market space itself. Historically, monasteries, convents, hospitals, noble households, military garrisons, inns, and large workshops represented concentrated demand. They required food in volume with regularity and often under contractual obligation. This demand pulled food out of circulation early, reshaping what remained available to ordinary buyers. You observe agents moving through markets with purpose. They do not browse, they collect. Institutional buyers often operated under standing agreements with specific sellers. These agreements were informal in some cities and formalized in others. Either way, they bypassed much of the competitive market process. Historically, these arrangements stabilized supply for institutions but destabilized open markets. Sellers favored guaranteed bulk sales even at lower margins. This removed food from general circulation before peak buying hours. Cities tolerated this imbalance because institutions provided social services and political stability. Monastic houses, for example, often purchased grain, vegetables, dairy, and fish in bulk early in the day. Their buyers moved quickly, targeting reliable sellers. Food destined for these kitchens rarely returned to market once diverted. It exited circulation permanently for the day. Noble households operated similarly but with greater flexibility. Their agents responded to price shifts and availability. When supply was high, they purchased more. When supply tightened, they relied on reserves or reduced consumption. Their purchasing behavior amplified volatility rather than smoothing it. You notice food streams peeling away from markets toward specific districts. Taverns, inns, and cookshops drew prepared and semi-prepared food steadily throughout the day. Their demand extended beyond peak hours, creating secondary circulation loops that sustained movement after markets thinned. Historically, cities attempted to regulate institutional buying to prevent hoarding and price manipulation. Ordinances limited early buying or bulk purchasing in some cases. Enforcement was selective. Institutions with influence were rarely constrained, and the result was a layered circulation system. Open markets served households and small buyers. Institutional channels operated in parallel, often invisibly. Food moved smoothly through these channels because demand was predictable and payment reliable. You remain still as food disappears into doorways, courtyards, and service entrances. What remains in the market now reflects not total supply, but what power has not already claimed. You're still standing as the system reveals its weaknesses. Medieval food movement was resilient but fragile. It functioned daily, but failure was common and expected. Bottlenecks formed not from catastrophe, but from ordinary strain. Historically, congestion was the most frequent disruption. Narrow streets, stalled carts, fallen animals, and disputes blocked movement abruptly. These obstructions had no rapid resolution mechanisms. Clearing depended on negotiation, brute force, or time. Food waited. Weather intensified every weakness. Rain reduced traction and slowed porters. Heat accelerated spoilage during delays. Wind disrupted river traffic. Seasonal change altered daylight and compressed schedules. The system adapted but never fully compensated. You observe disputes interrupting circulation. Market conflicts over space or pricing caused temporary freezes. Enforcement surges halted selling while officials intervened. These pauses disrupted timing more than supply. Historically, enforcement itself created bottlenecks. Surprise inspections closed stalls, measurement checks delayed sales, fines removed sellers temporarily, authority maintained order at the cost of flow. Transport failures were routine. Cart axles broke, pack animals collapsed, loads spilled, food stranded mid-route, often spoiled before recovery. Loss was localized but constant. No centralized mechanism absorbed it. You see food accumulating where movement fails, at corners, near gates, at market edges. These accumulations signal inefficiency, not abundance. They often trigger price drops that ripple outward. Cities responded reactively. They adjusted tolls temporarily, relaxed enforcement, or rerouted traffic. These responses addressed symptoms, not causes. The underlying constraints remained. Historically, the system survived because losses were distributed. No single failure halted the city. Small losses occurred everywhere, every day. They were absorbed into pricing, wages, and consumption habits. By late afternoon, the system sheds its weakest elements. Unsold food moves into secondary channels or exits circulation entirely. What remains visible is not what entered, but what endured. You remain still as the daily cycle approaches its final phase. The system prepares to reset. You are still in the city as afternoon gives way to late day. The market no longer hums. It exhales. Food that has not sold during peak hours begins to move again, but the logic governing its movement has changed. Earlier in the day, food moved toward opportunity. Now it moves away from loss. Historically, late-day food circulation followed different rules. Demand narrowed, Buyers became selective. Sellers became flexible. Prices dropped, not because food had changed, but because time had. You observe sellers consolidating stalls, displays shrink, assistants carry unsold goods back and forth between market edges and secondary buyers. Food that failed to sell early is rerouted toward taverns, cookshops, inns, and institutions with evening demand. These buyers accept lower quality and narrower selection in exchange for price. This redistribution extended food movement beyond the primary market system. It created secondary circulation paths that ran through neighborhoods rather than squares. Porters resumed work, but on shorter routes. Goods moved in smaller quantities. Speed mattered less than certainty. Historically, taverns and cookshops played a stabilizing role at this stage. They absorbed excess supply and extended the selling window for perishable foods. Cities relied on them quietly, even when they regulated them heavily. Without these outlets, loss would have been far greater. You notice that some sellers choose retreat instead of redistribution. They withdraw unsold food entirely, carrying it back toward homes, workshops, or institutional kitchens. This retreat does not imply storage in a modern sense. It reflects an attempt to recover value through alternative use, resale, or transformation the following day. Prices fall rapidly now. Sellers compete to offload remaining goods before daylight ends. Buyers with flexible schedules exploit this window. The system favors patience at this hour. Historically, enforcement relaxed late in the day. Officials focused on clearing spaces rather than policing rules. Market boundaries softened. Informal selling increased. Food flowed more freely but less visibly. You remain still as the market empties unevenly. What moves now is not abundance, but residue. The system sheds what it cannot hold. As evening approaches, food movement thins to threads. The day's circulation has reached its limit. You are standing in the same place as dusk settles. The city looks different now because food has vanished and movement has ended. By nightfall, most food has either been consumed, redirected, or withdrawn. Streets that were congested hours earlier are passable again. Market spaces are cleared. The visible system resets, but its consequences remain. Historically, cities did not track daily food movement outcomes systematically. They monitored toll revenue, not efficiency. Losses were not recorded. Shortages were noticed only when persistent. The system relied on repetition rather than measurement. You observe traces of the day: spilled grain near gates, trampled leaves in markets, empty baskets stacked against walls. These are not waste products. They are evidence of throughput. Economic outcomes are already fixed. Sellers who arrived early and positioned well profited. Those delayed by gates, routes, or congestion did not. Buyers who purchased early paid more. Those who waited paid less but accepted more narrow choices. Institutions secured supply quietly. Marginal sellers absorbed risk. Historically, today's movement constrained tomorrow's. Routes hardened through habit. Sellers adjusted departure times. Buyers shifted expectations. Authority reviewed tolls and enforcement, not flow. The system did not aim to optimize, it aimed to repeat. Success was measured by continuity, not efficiency. You remain stationary as night fully settles. The city does not plan the next day's food movement. The city assumes the movement of the day's food. Producers will depart before dawn. Gates will open, routes will congest, markets will fill, loss will occur, and supply will circulate. Food will move again tomorrow because the system endures. And there you have it, traveler. By nightfall, the food in this medieval town is gone from the streets because it moved where the system allowed it to go. Every delay, every toll, every narrow street, and every fixed market hour shaped what could be sold, who could buy it, and how much was lost along the way. Medieval cities did not manage food by optimizing flow. They managed food by repeating habits that worked well enough to survive. If you enjoy slow, detailed history focused on how everyday systems actually functioned, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss another fine historical gem from these archives. Until next time, stand still, rest your eyes, and let the city go quiet again.